Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is this good? Great. This is part of what the talk's about. So thank you so much, Dean Zheng, for inviting me here. I'm glad we were able to make it work out. We were interrupted by the pandemic, but 5 years later, here I am back at Taida, and it's nice to be back at Taida again. I've been here at the Graduate Institute of Musicology in the past to talk with students and meet with my wonderful colleagues, and it's just a pleasure to be here again. As Dean Zheng mentioned, today's talk is called Comparative Sound Systems, and I'll take you through what that means and what that is about today. This is a series of 3 talks, as was just mentioned, and I was asked to speak by Dean Zheng long ago about the interplay of humanity and techniques. And so I decided that I would mold each talk around a particular technical object or a particular technology and tell the story of that technology in ways that I hope that will make these technologies more interesting and more complex, and maybe, give you a greater sense of how your daily life is conducted in dialogue with technology, or how even you yourself or your aesthetics, your politics are shaped by these technologies. So today is about the loudspeaker. The next 2 will be about the camera and cinema. So let's start with the loudspeaker. When I was planning this talk, I was haunted actually by a particularly interesting contrast about the ways in which loudspeakers have been used in human history, but particularly in the 20th century. And one of the kind of most notorious uses of the loudspeaker is as a means of enforcing or creating totalitarian rule. And of course, the emblematic case here is the case of National Socialism, or the Nazi Party in Germany. And a statement that was attributed to Adolf Hitler. I haven't actually been able to discover whether this is true, whether he actually said this, but historically it's true. So we can imagine that he said this and that it would have been true, which is the quote here: "Without the loudspeaker, we would have never conquered Germany." Now, I chose this photograph for a very particular reason, which is that we don't see Adolf Hitler's face in this photograph. We're looking at him from behind. In front of him is a vast crowd. So vast that you can only see tiny, tiny ant-like figures in front of him, right? But what's really interesting is there's one interface between Hitler, the leader, the great leader, the dear leader, and the crowd below him, far below him, made miniature by the distance and by the massiveness of the crowd. And that's this, a microphone, right? We assume that the microphone also attaches to a huge array of speakers so that he can speak simultaneously to hundreds of thousands of people. And in fact, the Nazis came to power not only through mass rallies of this sort, sometimes with hundreds of thousands or even millions of people present who could listen to the voice of the leader through loudspeakers, but also, as we'll talk about later, through wireless networks of radios, radio broadcasts that brought the voice of Hitler to the people. So without the loudspeaker, we would have never conquered Germany. This is one pole or one side of what I want to talk about today. But there's a very different side of how we think about musical reproduction, and this comes from my own background and my own recent research on the music of Jamaica. That's a Caribbean island south of the United States, south of Cuba, about half the size of Taiwan, a population only 1/10 of Taiwan, but an island that has given the world a huge contribution in terms of popular music. Some of you may have heard of reggae music or ska music, and we'll talk about this more later. Right, so in Jamaica, and here we have a picture of a guy who's actually built his own loudspeakers. This is what's called a Jamaican sound system. It's homemade. I actually was walking by and saw his speaker boxes and thought they were beautiful, handcrafted, hand-painted, and asked him if I could take a picture. And in thinking about this as a very local kind of practice of building and constructing sound systems for music reproduction in Jamaica, I thought how different this is from the model of Hitler. And in fact, in Jamaica, there's a very common saying, which I really love, which is this: the only good system is a sound system. So what does this mean? Basically, the idea is that political systems, economic systems are bad. They're exploitative. And if you're from Jamaica, you understand why that's the case. Jamaica was founded on slavery and the exploitation of black people's labor to make empire in Britain, to make Britain rich. But in that same gesture, making people in Jamaica quite poor. So the only good system, Well, there is no good system politically, but the only kind of good system that we have in Jamaica are sound systems. Why? Because sound systems, loudspeakers, bring joy to the people. They give a voice to common people. They allow people to speak their minds and actually speak against the system of political oppression that has kept them down and kept them in bondage, really. So the only good system here is a sound system. We'll talk later about what a Jamaican sound system is as opposed to, say, a Nazi sound system. So I'm going to set up at the beginning of the lecture a kind of polarity or a kind of dialectic between two different ways of understanding how sound technology works. We can think of sound technology, or the 喇叭扬声器, 播音器, as being top-down and totalitarian, as state propaganda or the voice of the ruler, Hitler in the case that we just brought up, but we could think of others like Chairman Mao in China during the Cultural Revolution, whatever it may be, as an instrument of control and messaging, as a military-grade technology that can expand to hundreds of thousands, millions of people, or even to a whole nation, and finally as a means to impose or fight for territorial control, that is, controlling space through sound. Right now I'm controlling the space of this auditorium through sound because I have the technology in my hand, right? None of you do. So I'm the ruler right now. That's one way to think of how technology imposes control over space, over territory. In the Jamaican example, however, we have a kind of music technology that's bottom up and liberatory, that is the voice of the people rather than the voice of the ruler, that's handmade rather than technologically imposed by a military or a state, that has civilian uses, music and dance, and sometimes telling the truth or telling the news to people in a community. And finally, it's a means not to impose territorial control, but to build a community space for people to enjoy together, to come together in solidarity. So this is the basic dialectic I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so these two potentialities for music technology or amplification may seem like they're opposites, right? They may seem totally different, diametrically opposed. But as we'll see in the talk, actually, Hitler's loudspeaker and Jamaican sound systems actually come out of some of the same technological innovations, and they actually emerge from the same history. And here, just to preview a bit, one of the hinge for this history is actually World War II. And we'll talk about how World War II is the sort of big bang for audio technology in the 20th century, and how this relates to both the German case, the Chinese case, actually the Taiwanese case that we'll talk about, and the Jamaican case as well. Okay, so these two poles represent different possibilities for transduction technology. I'll talk about what transduction is in a moment, but they're actually historically linked. All right, so by the late 19th century, after Edison's invention of the phonograph, one thing that's quite interesting is early phonographs also rely on the forms of the human ear, as well as natural forms that are used to amplify sound. So things like horns, but also things like shells or seashells. And you can see this in the design of these early phonographic machines. This is an analog machine. There's no electricity involved. It's usually hand cranked, but it actually can produce quite a loud sound. I have a machine like this in my office at Berkeley, and when I play it for students, they're often just like completely shocked and amazed. They're like, but there's no electricity. How does that make it sound? But of course, it's borrowing the physics of sound from nature to make a louder sound. But audio technology really changes very profoundly in the early 20th century when people figure out how to put electricity and transduction together to vastly increase the range, the volume, the reach of mechanized sound. And so the crucial invention here is by two guys who aren't very well known, Kellogg and Rice, who invent something called the moving coil speaker. And basically the moving coil speaker is a way to put a magnet next to a cone. Electrical current comes through the magnet and it makes the cone move back and forth in conjunction with the electrical signal, producing a very loud sound. And then you need an amplifier to create the electricity to amplify that sound even more loudly. So basically this kind of technique of moving coil speakers are now everywhere in the world, right? They are in your pocket, they're in your phone, they're at home, in your home stereo, they're in your television set, they're in your earbuds, in your laptop, in those tiny little speakers there. They all use a similar principle of the moving coil electrical production of sound. So this was kind of a major moment in world history that you may have missed. The way that we discovered how to transduce electricity into sound in ways that transform the range and the volume of sound throughout the world. It's one reason we live in such a noisy world, because of the introduction of Kellogg and Rice's moving coil speakers. So transducers are everywhere. And in fact, we're using them right now when I speak to you through, I'm not sure that loudspeakers are in this room, but hopefully they're working and you can hear me through them. Right. Okay. So once you have the loudspeaker, you can do something even more interesting, which is you can produce whole systems that are based on loudspeakers that can speak to more and more people at further and further removes, that is farther and farther away. And these kind of systems are usually called public address systems. They started being built in the 1920s, and they're still very much part of our world, wherever you look or wherever you listen for them. Even actually in Taiwan, when you walk through some old streets or old alleys, you'll see exactly these kind of speakers mounted on telephone poles, because there used to be, there still is actually a public address system for emergencies. It used to be used more. It's used very seldom now, but it's there. Right? These examples are from mainland China, and you can see a transistorized loudspeaker, and then someone mounting one of these loudspeakers onto a pole. Right? And I think this image is very interesting because it shows us that a loudspeaker never exists in isolation. A loudspeaker is always part of what we call an assemblage of technical objects. So no device is an island. A public address system or a sound system is a 组合, an assemblage of objects. So you can't just have loudspeakers to have a public address system. You also need to have a sound source, that is me speaking, or a radio broadcast, or a record that's playing, or a CD, or an MP3 that's playing, right? But that needs to be coupled with an amplifier to boost the signal, and then a preamplifier to control the signal, the volume or the character of the signal. And then finally, you even need cables or connections to, or sometimes wireless links to connect the system together. Again, here we have this guy stringing this thing up to wires on a pole. So you also need the infrastructure, like poles or generators, to make the PA system work. But it's not even that simple, because the assemblage includes not just the playback devices themselves, but also the people who are the humans who are involved in this whole system, right? So often we think of ourselves as separate from our devices, or our devices as separate from us. But in fact, any kind of assemblage, a technical assemblage, is made up of people and their devices together, working in concert together, or manipulating one another in different ways. We can be manipulated by our devices, as I'm sure you all know from your phones, that control your lives, but also we have the possibility of manipulating or getting something out of them as well. So they're the humans in the systems. They can be operators, orators, like Hitler at his rally, singers, broadcasters, DJs, but also listeners, audiences who, like you guys right now, kind of resonate to the system or are subject to the system and resonate to it. And actually, I can also get feedback then that comes back to me as I'm speaking. Do you look interested? Do you look bored? Do you laugh at my jokes? And then I can adjust the system through that kind of feedback, right? So it's a dynamic system, not just a passive or one-way system either. Okay, so the elephant in the room of these kind of assemblages is also the room, that is the space in which the sound is resonating. We're in one kind of space now. You can hear me. My voice might sound a particular way because it's going through this equipment and because this sound has its own echo characteristics, right? So the room is important for how things sound. It's also important because this is a classroom. You would feel different if we were outside and this was a political rally and I was, I don't know, Lai Ching-te saying something or whatever, then it would be a very different scene. So the room or the space matters in terms of how things sound, but also the social meaning of what's coming through the PA system, right? It could be a factory, a city street, a stadium. That's a different kind of PA system and a different kind of assemblage. Okay, so the last thing I want to make clear is sound systems also interact with their natural environment in very interesting ways. We'll come back to this later, but it's one of the main points I want to get to in the end of this talk, which is that we might think that devices like this, microphones, loudspeakers, are completely separate from nature, right? Technology and nature are separate. But in fact, these two things are actually sometimes designed to interact with each other. And they can create very interesting harmonies with one another or disharmonies with one another. We'll come back to that point later. All right, so a little bit more history about PA systems or public address systems. The earliest ones were invented in the 1920s. And they're really designed for what were the new media of that era. This was an era in which cinema was just becoming a world-beating form of entertainment and commercial activity. It's a time when wireless broadcasting, that is listening to the radio, was first becoming something that most people in the developed world could experience. And so often PA systems were linked to the cinema, that is in theaters, or linked to radio broadcasts, or finally also linked to one of their major uses, which was, again, political rallies. Some of the first political rallies using PA systems took place in the United States in the 1920s. And sometimes they were actually linked to a kind of telegraphic link so that they could be transcribed and then brought from, say, New York all the way to San Francisco, which was miraculous at that time. Okay, so that's the early history of these PA systems. What's really interesting about PA systems, too, and the way they were designed and the way loudspeakers were designed is that just like Edison, the early designers of PA systems were interested primarily in the human voice and in conveying the human voice. They're interested in messaging. They're interested in content. So if you look at the actual machines and the loudspeakers that PA systems were based on, they have a very, very narrow dynamic range. That is, they're mostly stuck in the mid-range where the human voice is. They don't go sub-bass, low bass, like right? They don't go super high either because the engineering was interested in capturing dialogue in films, capturing the human voice in radio, and capturing political messaging from politicians. You can even see this in the title or the brand names of early PA systems and loudspeakers. One of the earliest companies, which was from Oakland, California, near where I live, was called Magnavox. In Latin, that means great voice or big voice, right? So the voice is central to that. One of the most famous loudspeaker companies is called Voice of the Theater because it was made for cinema theaters to convey the dialogue in sound films, right? So that's Voice of the Theater. It became Altec Lansing later on, still a big speaker company to this day. So by the 1930s and the 1940s, PA systems were ubiquitous. They're basically everywhere, and they were being used by the modern state for rallies of not just, 200 people that we have in this room, but again, hundreds of thousands of people by the likes of Hitler or Mussolini or American political figures like FDR, Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. And they were also incorporated into broadcast networks, especially in Germany, but also in Russia, Japan with NHK, the United States with RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, and Great Britain with the BBC, right? British Broadcasting Corporation. And public address systems, thus, during the 30s, an era of the rise of fascism, of the rise of also socialism and communist movements, became a voice for contention and a voice for the state to speak to its people, right? The voice of the state. One way to understand this is that through public address systems, if you could talk with not just the people in this room, but the people in all the rooms across the nation, you create a new kind of space, not just a one-to-one space, but a one-to-many space, a space in which the whole nation itself becomes an acoustic resonating chamber. Keep doing that. So this poster is really fascinating to show exactly this taking place. What's going on here, this is in German, obviously. It says, all of Germany listens to the Führer with the people's receiver. The image itself I find really fascinating. Like, what don't you see in this picture? You don't see Hitler, so what do you see instead? The radio receiver, the machine, right? So it's actually a very weird picture. What's replacing Hitler is a radio receiver, as if Hitler himself is only an effect of the media through which he speaks, right? Actually, the media through which he speaks becomes more important than Hitler himself. He is, for all intents and purposes, the radio receiver, the speaker. He's the speaker, of course, he's the orator, but he's also the speaker, to use a pun in English, right? He's not just 一个人，他也是一个喇叭。然后有点分不清哪个是人，哪个是喇叭. So we can call him a kind of media effect. What's also really interesting about this montage is that you see a huge crowd surrounding this huge speaker right? In actuality, that radio speaker was probably only this big, but it's been blown up because what we're trying to imagine here is that the speaker creates a national acoustic space. All of Germany is listening to the speaker, and all of Germany has become a figure for the mass in this picture. So what's happening here is, in fact, that Germany in the 1930s mass-produced a particular radio receiver, which was called the Volksempfänger VE301, and basically gave it almost for free, very cheap, to almost every citizen across the country, so that they would all listen to the same radio receiver and all listen to the same speeches and the same music coming from a central radio station. And this was linked to Hitler very closely. I think the model number, VE301, is celebrating his birthday on March 1st. Right, that's his birthday on March 1st. And so the propaganda becomes a kind of state assemblage where the actual speaker stands in for Hitler. Of course, as you all know, the 1930s are the gateway into one of the most horrific catastrophes that we've experienced in modern times, World War II, which took the lives of untold millions of people, resulted, for instance, in Taipei itself being bombed by American airplanes because Taipei was Taihoku at that time, under Japanese control. And so World War II came everywhere, to the United States, to Japan, to Taiwan, wherever in the world you were. But one of the things it also did was also create a technological leap in terms of acoustic technologies. And what we see here is that a lot of military technologies, a lot of military conflicts actually spur forward technical advancement. And that's kind of a truism of media history, but it's certainly true with acoustic technology. And I'll take you through this a little bit right now. See that we have a very odd and kind of uncomfortable picture here. This is also a picture from Magnavox, that company that invented PA systems. And what it is an invention to allow fighter pilots or airplane pilots to speak through a PA system. And also, it's a noise canceling system so that they could fly but still communicate with the other people in the airplane. So that kind of technology was developed in World War II. But this is only the tip of the acoustic iceberg. I could talk actually for an hour or two about this particular topic, but some of the things that were invented at that time are, one, something called the ghost army. The United States in the 1940s and Europe invented a ghost army where basically they'd invent huge loudspeakers. They would create or play back the noise of tanks or the noise of military attacks, but they'd play them back in the wrong place to tempt the Germans to think that the American troops were there when they were actually over there, and they did that through a kind of sonic subterfuge or a sonic trick. But you can imagine how loud these loudspeakers needed to be to actually trick the Germans into opening fire or moving in the wrong direction to create a kind of advantage for the US Army. So that's just one of these kind of tricks. This is actually a British sound truck that was doing that kind of what's called psyops or 心战, 心理战争, psychological warfare. We also had the invention during the war by Germany of magnetic tape recording, which became the primary medium for recording music after the war. And actually, at the time, Americans had no idea that there was such a thing as looped magnetic tape recording, but they'd start to listen in on German radio, and they'd say, hey, we just heard this speech yesterday, and it's the same speech. What's going on? That's impossible, right? When actually Germany fell, American troops then found these machines, magnetic tape, reel-to-reel tape recorders, and they're like, wow, this is great. And they actually took them back to California and made them into a new industry for pop music recording. So we can see there actually a good example of how a military technology then became a civilian technology. And all the great records, Elvis Presley, the Beatles, whoever, until the age of digital recording were all recorded through this kind of invention that the Germans came up with basically to keep their national acoustic space running seamlessly during the war. Another one is sonar. Sonar is a really interesting technology. You use a transducer mounted on a submarine to ping out and thus do something called echolocation, so you could know where your enemy was in the ocean, or you could map the bottom of the seafloor. So sonar is also a transducer technology or a loudspeaker technology that then maps the world through sound, right? We'll come back to sonar in a little bit as well. So I'll just show you some pictures of these bizarre and sort of beautiful, but also macabre inventions from this period. This is a United States sound truck that was used for the Ghost Army, I believe. Sometimes they also use these to basically play sound so loud that it would scare the enemy troops into surrendering. Or they'd use it for propaganda, like, you're going to die, you might as well surrender, right? That kind of thing. This is the invention of sonar before the war that became one of the main ways that the US developed some dominance undersea during the war. And this, now getting closer to home here in Taiwan, is an example of how these technologies then became part of the Cold War after World War II. So what we have here is a Chinese propaganda poster from the 1950s. And, well, you all can read Chinese, so you know what it's saying, right? 美国的任何战争挑战都绝对杀不倒中国人民. But what's quite interesting is this propaganda is envisioned as a huge loudspeaker, a huge transducer aimed from the mainland at, I assume this is like Zhang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, who's being absolutely kind of intimidated and shrunken by the volume of the voice of Zhou Zongli, that's Zhou Enlai, who was the kind of 外交部长 at that time for China. So you can see, even in the imagination of territorial dispute, sound looms very large, or sound rings out very loud in this kind of poster. Now, on the other side of the straits, of course, Taiwan was also practicing psychological warfare through sound. And you can see here that we have a 信战资料带. This is a Psy-War data booklet that was used on the island of Jinmen, which is only about 8 miles from the coast of mainland China, and was in active contention, an active state of warfare throughout the 1950s. And one of the techniques that was used on both sides was psychological warfare through loudspeakers, right? And this gets us then to here. This is on the island of Jinmen. I don't know if some of you have been there. It's on the coast by Beishan in Jinmen. So it's about 8 miles from Xiamen across the strait. And I was shocked when I first saw this building because it actually might be one of the world's largest sound systems ever constructed from 1967. It has 48 horn reflex speakers. Each of these is a massive speaker. And they're so loud and so highly powered that they could project about 25 kilometers across the strait, all along the coast of Fujian province. And what they were usually projecting was propaganda about taking back the mainland, that kind of thing. Yeah, and we'll talk about this for a moment. If you ever go to Jinmen, it's worth seeing this. It's a really amazing structure. It's about 8 stories tall. Yeah. And here you can see the speakers mounted inside each of those kind of portholes. So this is usually called a guangboqiang. And this is not actually the only one in that area. There's another one in Mashan nearby. And there's actually quite a few others on outlying islands. And on the coast in China, they also had a set of their own loudspeakers that were playing back and forth. So it was a kind of sound clash between the two rival polities that were trying to project territorial control. So again, sound as a means of territorial control. These days, you may have heard that there's still these kind of sound arrays on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. And they often play music back and forth at each other at excruciating volumes, sometimes K-pop, sometimes propaganda. I'd probably rather hear propaganda than K-pop, but that's just me. Now, one of the uses of these kind of sound towers or sound walls was to project the sound of popular figures. Here, Deng Lijun, or Teresa Teng, the great Taiwanese singer, over across the sea to the mainland.
亲爱的大陆同胞们，你们好，我是邓丽君。我现在来到金门的广播站，向大陆沿海的同胞们广播。我今天要跟大家说的是，我很高兴的能够站在自由祖国的第一前线金门。我感觉到非常快乐，非常幸福。我希望在大陆的同胞也可以跟我们享受到一样的民主跟自由。唯有在自由、民主、富庶的生活环境下，才能拥有实现个人理想的机会。也唯有全体青年 都能自由发挥聪明才智，国家的未来才会有充满光明和希望。我希望很快的能够再回到金门，跟金门的弟兄们见面，当然还有跟大陆沿海的同胞们通话。在这里呢，祝大家身体健康，民主万岁！谢谢。
So that's from, I believe, the very end of this era in 1980. It was a television program that was shown here in Taiwan. And it's a very interesting clip. I think it wasn't loud enough in the room. If it was a little bit louder, you could have heard more clearly that when the camera cuts away from Deng Lijun inside her broadcasting booth to a shot of the actual guangbo-qiang, the sound of her voice changes because you're listening to it now from outside, and her voice is now being carried by the wind and actually being amplified 100-fold, maybe 1,000-fold, so that it could make its journey across the straits. And what you hear there is her voice changes. She's no longer just an individual human being. Now she's part of a military assemblage or a military technology. And her voice actually then comes into contact with a larger environment, that is, of the wind and the water between where she's broadcasting in Mashan all the way over to Xiamen. And this is really interesting because on the one hand, it shows the ways in which humans and their devices are actually linked together and leave an imprint on one another. The famous sound of Deng Lijun's voice here becomes a military weapon, right? We don't usually think of Deng Lijun as a military weapon unless you really don't like her music. But here she becomes a military weapon. The other thing that's really interesting about this is she herself becomes part of the environment, the cross-straits environment, quite literally. So when we listen to accounts of people who lived on the other side in Fujian, who listened to these kind of broadcasts, they often felt that it was very Nanting at first, right? And also, you couldn't hear it if it was cloudy. You couldn't hear it if it was too windy or the wind was going in the wrong direction. But over time, they realized that when there was a bright moonlit night and there was no wind and it was warm, you could hear the broadcasts the best. Those were also the nights when often people would be walking along the seashore with their lovers. And so gradually over time, there became a romantic association between the voice of, say, Deng Lijun or Deng Lijun's songs coming across the water on moonlit nights that were clear and warm without wind and fog. And people started to actually enjoy her music that way over time, but not at first. But you can see here that there's another kind of transformation from her voice, a female romantic voice, into military-grade technology, but then finally into something else when it's subjected to the environment and subjected to actual listeners who have their own lives, their own ways of listening, their own feelings, their own affective struggles or joys in life. So it's a very interesting kind of feedback loop, again, in this military-grade system of sound. I have a quote here about people. This is someone who was listening at that time on the other side of the strait. So now I'm going to switch gears entirely and move to a faraway place that probably none of you have been to, or not many of you have been to. I hope some of you have, because it's a beautiful place where my family is from. But it's the other example of how sound systems can be used, or another possibility for sound systems. And this is from Jamaica. So you can see on the map that Jamaica is between the United States and South America. It's a tropical island, a little bit like Taiwan in that sense, although quite a bit smaller. And it's a place where people locally invented a new kind of sound system that really changed the global sound of pop music throughout the world. So how did this happen? I think probably a lot of you might not know a lot about Jamaica, so I have a brief history of the island here. It was first discovered, quote unquote, by Christopher Columbus, that Christopher Columbus, the famous one who discovered the New World in 1494. He and his fellow Spaniards very quickly killed through disease and hard labor almost all of the Yuanzhuming who lived there, that is, indigenous peoples of Jamaica. Eventually it was colonized by England, and England turned Jamaica into one of the most productive, wealthy, brutal, and cruel, basically slave colonies that the world has ever seen. So by the 1700s or 1800s, Jamaica was worth more to Britain than all of the 7 states of the United States, right? Than all of the East Coast of the United States. Why? Because sugar was incredibly lucrative. And the other reason, because all the labor that was growing the sugar was free, because it was slave labor by Africans who were brought against their will from the west coast of Africa to populate Jamaica. And they're brought not in their hundreds of thousands, but over time in their millions. Why? Because they worked them so hard that many of them just simply died. And it was cheaper to buy new slaves than to replace them or allow them to reproduce. So that's the kind of brutality, the kind of oppression, the kind of system, to go back to that word, that most Jamaicans faced until modern times, and certainly until Jamaica's independence from Great Britain in 1962. Okay. The population there, however, was not only Jamaicans. Once slavery was abolished, there was also a substantial population of Chinese people from southern China, actually Hakka people, almost entirely Hakka people from Guangdong, who immigrated to Jamaica as basically indentured laborers, and also people from South Asia, the north of India. So it's a multicultural, multiracial society, mostly people from Africa, but also Chinese and South Asian people, as well as various others from England and across Europe. So basic history of the society. Here's the place where Columbus, quote unquote, discovered Jamaica. It's called Discovery Bay, and you see some cute Jamaican school kids there in their colonial style British uniforms by the sea. Okay, so what is the Jamaican sound system? I talked about top-down or military models for sound systems before. In Jamaica, what you had is a very strange kind of bottom-up technological creativity. We can call it tinkering, that is playing around with cast off or discarded or second-rate components to make a new kind of technology. So it's improvised engineering of equipment for outdoor dance parties, basically for parties that took place outside. Jamaica's hot like here, and so you'd have your dance parties outside. So you needed big speakers to play to crowds in downtown Kingston, which is the capital of Jamaica. And so people invented a new kind of like portable disco. And this was before disco existed in the US. Actually, one reason we have discos elsewhere is because Jamaica invented the disco outdoors, right? So what we basically invented was an assemblage of two turntables that you could use back and forth, an amplifier, usually a big tube amplifier, and big speakers so that you could have enough amplitude so that people could really dance and really enjoy the music, right? When I say two turntables, that sounds familiar to you, it's because basically the idea of a sound system became the basis for hip hop in the United States as well. The person who invented hip hop parties in the US was a Jamaican who brought that technology up to New York City in the 1970s. So where did they get this technology? Actually, a lot of it was based on military technologies like radio circuits, tube amplifiers, tape loops, sound effects, and high-powered speakers, which found repurposed civilian uses in Kingston after they had been developed during the war in Europe. And so what you develop in Jamaica, especially in the city, in Kingston, is a kind of culture of what we called sound clashes, which again, were about territory, right? If I'm having my dance party here, I want to attract all the clients to my dance party. And now you have your sound system over there, which is trying to rival me and attract clients over there. So what developed is a kind of competition between different sound systems. Often they'd use the term sounds for short, where people would develop the best equipment, find the best records, have the best DJs, and then win the party, basically. So that's a culture that created a lot of innovation in Jamaica as people are like basically fighting to have the best records, the best music, and the best sound, right? The best amplifiers, the best speakers. And this kind of musical composition led to genres which are now globally known and globally loved. Ska is one that developed in the 60s in Jamaica, reggae or legua, which developed in the 70s in Jamaica, and then dancehall, which is still hugely popular throughout the world and has all kinds of spin-offs like reggaeton, hip-hop, electronic dance music, etc. So this is kind of a big bang for modern popular music that took place in a pretty small island, in a pretty small city, using cast-off military technology. Very interesting story. So how did this happen? Well, basically, during World War II, Jamaica was still a British colony. And a lot of very smart and somewhat well-educated or very determined Jamaicans were determined to join the war effort for Britain. And they were recruited to join up with the Royal Air Force. Actually, one of my uncles was among these people who actually went to fly bomber planes for the Royal Air Force in Britain during the war. Here's a monument to them in the center of London, in Brixton, which is a Jamaican neighborhood in Brixton. So they went to the RAF, and actually a lot of them were assigned to the electrical engineering or basically PA system tasks. So they worked on sonar systems, they worked on electrical engineering systems, they worked on airplane broadcast systems and communication systems as well. And so when they got back to Jamaica, they had all these quite amazing skills, and they put them to work making music. So one of the people who is quite famous for this is a guy who's really an unsung genius. His name is Hedley Jones. He went to Great Britain. He worked on a sonar unit in Great Britain. But when he came back to Jamaica, he became an inventor. He had this little workshop at home, and he used all the skills he'd learned to invent, first of all, Jamaica's first electric guitar, which was actually arguably before some of the electrical guitars like the Les Paul that was invented in the US. He invented this in the 1940s. But he also basically invented handmade amplifiers using hand-strung transformers that could play bass frequencies more than any other amplifiers in the world up to that point. Why? Because Jamaicans really appreciate bass music or bass heavy music in their dance music. And they're playing a lot of R&B from the US, and then their own music was very bass heavy. So you needed to be able to reproduce those frequencies. Now this is something I find really, really interesting. We talked about how most PA systems during the war or before were based on the human voice and the mid-range. They did not go down to below like 80 hertz, but Jamaican music needed you to go down to like 20 hertz to get that sub bass that could really shake your body or even make your pants or your shirt rumble along with the sound of the bass, right? So Hedley Jones invented amps that could do that. Pretty amazing. He also invented ways of putting together speaker arrays that would capture all the frequencies of the kind of music that Jamaicans liked. So he invented, thus, the Jamaican sound system. Now, as soon as he invented these kind of amps, then people were really eager to take them up and buy them and test them out in these sound classes we were talking about. So this is actually one of the first sound system entrepreneurs. His name is Tom Wong. Probably you can tell from his name that he's part Chinese. He was actually Hakka Chinese, mixed African and Hakka Chinese descent. He owned a hardware store, but he was like, wow, I'm going to buy these amps and create a sound system, which is what he did. So he became one of the earliest entrepreneurs and creators of this kind of sound system ecology in Jamaica. Here are some photos of early sound systems. You can see that they're developing speaker boxes that are all about bass frequencies. Here's another one. And here are the ideas that the sound system would be the voice of the people. This is a sound system actually called the voice of the people, rather than the voice of the ruler, of the British colonial authority, or of the state. It's the voice of people in the ghetto who are having a good time and could share political critiques and pleasure at the same time through the sound system and through their own music. Here's some early speaker boxes, and again, you can see that they're very beautifully handmade. They have these big, huge slots on the bottom to increase the bass reflex response. And almost all the woofers are woofers, not tweeters, right? So you have a very bass-heavy sound. And actually the mid-range is quite empty. It's not about voice, it's about bass and the very high-frequency sounds as well. Here's another example of a sound system. This is from like 1980 with a proud family that's built their own sound system, standing in front of it. And again, in a way, you can think of these speakers as a visual representation of the sound of the music, because if you know anything about speaker design, you'll see that both of these units here are woofers. So the woofers are actually like 16-inch woofers, which is huge, and will produce a really, really big thumping, body-crunching bass sound. And then above that, you only have one set of tweeters, right? So it shows you which frequencies people enjoy. And they design the speakers around the kind of music that they enjoy and that they want to hear and that work for dances. Okay, so this gives rise to a phrase about Jamaican music that it's bass culture. Okay, so public address systems, then for propaganda, like the Hitler example that we saw, we could also think of examples in, say, the People's Republic of China during the 1960s, the Maoist era, where there were loudspeakers everywhere to convey the central broadcasting radio or the voice of the party, of the Communist Party to the people, or the PA systems that we have here in Taiwan, which were based on the human voice again. But in Jamaica, there's a very different kind of emphasis. The Jamaican model of sound systems emphasizes dance rhythms, bodily pleasure, community resistance and resonance with one another, Because if you're in the dance space together, outdoors, and you're all resonating to the same bass beat, it's not necessarily about a linguistic message, right? It's about being together in the sound, inside the space that is created by the sound. Resonating together within that space as a community, rather than having a top-down voice talking at you or telling you who to be or what the system is going to be. So again, the only good system is a sound system because it's not telling you to be part of the system. It's allowing you to be part of a community instead. So sound systems, and this is the parlance that was used in Jamaica, will be voiced to resonate with human bodies rather than to resonate at the frequency necessarily of human voices. This is actually, they were really brilliant kind of vernacular, inventive engineers who had very few tools and very few resources. But I've heard, for instance, that they would have circuits in their sound system whereby when the sound party was empty, you'd have one kind of voicing for the system. And once it got full and the sound started bouncing off bodies, that would change the nature of the sound. Then you could flick a switch and it would change the sound entirely to fit the fact that now people are here, now people are part of the assemblage, now the sound needs to change to basically reflect the way that sound waves were vibrating off of bodies, not just vibrating outside in an empty space. So it's quite brilliant use of that technology at that time. So what we see is out of this kind of culture, basically people would cut a record, they'd bring it to the sound system. If people liked it and danced to it, that would reflect then back into the recording practice where people would say, let's do that again, or let's try that sound again. And you had a very, very powerful and very quick feedback loop whereby records that were tried out in the sound system would then reach the ears and the information of studio engineers who would then adjust the sound to what people liked. Right? So that meant within a very few years, you had a huge amount of innovation musically, and the sound got more and more bassy and more innovative sonically because of that. And actually many of the studio innovations of pop music, like remixing, come out of this Jamaican sound system feedback loop, whereby people would be like, wow, that's a really cool effect. You'd play it in the sound system, people were like, yeah, play it again. Then you'd bring it back to the studio and do more of that until you developed an entirely new kind of music, which is called dub music, which is basically a remix-based music created in the studio out of older tracks. And I'm going to play you an example of that. So when you listen to the music of this period, you'll hear a very heavy bass. We don't have good enough speakers here to get the really, the real feeling of it, but I'll play you a sound. And then you'll have a lot of audio effects that are played in the studio that create a kind of spacey sense or a sense of a big space opening up for you in the dance hall space. So I'll play you one example of this kind of music called, it's called Zion Gate Dub. And like a lot of Jamaican music, there's a very spiritual background to a song like this. This song is about wanting to return to a lost homeland, a spiritual homeland, a homeland you were taken away from, to a land of oppression where the system down presses you, as you'd say in Jamaica. And a lot of the imagery was Christian imagery. So Zion is a kind of promised land, the land you can return to, a land that's happier, a land where there's no oppressive system. So this song is about wanting to get inside the gates of Zion before the gates close forever, right? But it's a dub version of that, meaning it's a remix. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that kind of music or understand what's actually going on in it. But one thing I would emphasize is there are parts of the music, and this is, again, there's an original track that's basically becoming deconstructed in the studio. A lot of effects like reverb and delay are added to create a kind of spiritual sense of a different or otherworldly space, a world beyond this world, a world beyond systems. And sonically, if you were in the dance hall space or the sound system space, what you would hear is a thundering bass, and then often there's a drop where there's only the bass and the drums. And especially in the drums, you hear the sound of the cymbals that are very, very high and very, very sizzly, very high frequency. But the entire middle of the sound spectrum, that is the mid-range, is actually evacuated. And this is really unprecedented in popular music before this, that you'd have only sub-bass and high frequency sounds, right? So what does that mean, or how does that experience by dancers, and by dancers I could also say worshipers in the church of dub music or in the church of the spirituality of Jamaican music? It means that basically the sound system, those speaker boxes, are creating a virtual space, right? In between the bass and the high frequency, in which we, the listeners, the dancers, can inhabit a different world, right? It's creating a kind of territory for us to live in, for us to travel to, and not a territory for us to contend over, to fight over. So again, there's a very different attitude towards territoriality than, say, those speaker boxes that are projecting across the Taiwan states and saying, I own you. No, you don't own me. I own you, right? It's a very different use of this kind of technology for spiritual worship or for collectivity. So I find that quite interesting that the same technology from World War II is repurposed in profoundly different ways in this kind of music. Now I want to end with some thoughts about environmental sound and the way that human technology also interacts not just with humans, but with topographies and natural sounds. One of the interesting things about the sound system in Jinmen that I talked about is that actually broadcasters in Jinmen or across the straits in Fujian had to learn to work with nature at that point, right? If the wind was blowing in one way, it wouldn't work, right? If it was blowing in another way, you could slow down your voice or modulate your voice so that it could project in ways that would cross the straits. If it was foggy, you'd have to speak in different ways than if it was clear. So there's a way in which even a military-grade design loudspeaker system can't defeat nature. You need to work with nature, or it's an assemblage with nature. This is also true with Jamaican sound systems because they're almost always used outside. And what you basically have is mobile sound systems that will go from town to town or village to village and set up night after night and have a dance party. They'll string up the system, as they say, and then all the people in the village will come down and dance and have a nice time and listen to this kind of music. But Jamaica, like Taiwan, actually is a very mountainous island. And so you have a coastal region, and then above the coast, whether you're in Kingston or in the countryside, there's hills, right? So that means that the sound system can play people. That is, it can make their bodies resonate with the bass, but it can also play the island itself, right? So it's not like you're playing the sound system. The sound system is also playing you, and it's playing the land of the island itself, which I think is really interesting. And you can certainly hear it if you're in Jamaica, because wherever you are at night, you'll hear sound systems that are bouncing off the hills, right? That are playing up against the hills. This is a phenomenon actually called night noise, and it's basically ubiquitous on the island, where you hear coastal sound systems bouncing up against the hills or the mountains and then bouncing back down. It's an acoustic environment that's pretty total. So the island itself is an assemblage, or part of the assemblage. So it's not like sound systems are separate from nature or separate from the hills, the trees, or even the animal life of the island. So this is a picture of Kingston. It's from the hills. You're looking down on the city. And most of the sound system parties would be down on this plain, but then bouncing up into the hills. Another feature of Jamaican nightlife is that there's a ubiquitous sound every night as the sun goes down of tree frogs. This is a Jamaican tree frog. It's very, very cute, right? 很可爱的. You'll probably never see one in person because they're very tiny and very, very hard to find. But they are very loud and they are everywhere, right? Yeah. Do you have tree frogs in Taiwan? I've never really, yeah, okay, yeah, they can be very loud. So basically, my theory is actually sound systems often play in concert with tree frogs at night, because what you'll hear if you're anywhere in the countryside is bass. Bass travels slowly but quite far because it's a low wavelength. So you hear bass, you'll maybe hear voices coming at a different speed or a different rate, but all this is accompanied by the high frequency pitch of the tree frogs coming through the air. So actually it's a kind of musical assemblage of the island itself playing with its sound systems. I often like to also imagine that the bass itself is volcanic and it's coming up from the geography of the island at the same time. So just to finish today, I have a recording that I made in my hometown at night of a sound system. This is the hometown where my dad is from and my family's from. So you can see it's the same. There's the blue mountains in the background. They go up pretty high, like almost as high as some of the mountains in Taiwan. And the sound systems will be in town and they'll bounce off the mountains, and then you'll hear the sound of tree frogs coming in the distance. So we'll end with this. Then it's hard to hear. Okay, that's it. If you listen with headphones or with bigger speakers, you could actually just hear the thump of bass, and then a voice in the mid-range, and then a high end, only that beautiful, lovely sound of tree frogs playing in a very human and environmental assemblage with loudspeakers. So that's where I'm ending today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk.